the fey imp in all living things. My lines posit a firefly, a holy mystery, a nymph who flits to wiry life in the fury of a found tale, now a fey moment. We let any fire drown my woe, this myth for the wild foe, this elegy of fey sorrow. We let any fire in great moans of misery howl a lyric at thy chosen kiss, a myth wise with a holy mystery. I, who waken in my flame, ink my airy loss.
If there were ever any doubt about my willingness to swallow my pride and have a guest on the show who could easily outshine my most extravagant efforts, let this podcast stand as a testimony to my ability to do that. This is Christian Bök, who will be familiar to many of you. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Christian is one of the most remarkable poets alive today. And it is a total pleasure, Christian, to welcome you here to Cale. You've come all the way from Leeds, a very long journey, to film this episode. And I'm very grateful you're here, and it's just really good to see you.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to see you too, Samuel. Thank you for inviting me to participate in your podcast. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
It's been 10 years since the Xenotext Book 1 was released. That was your most recent full-scale publication. And you're now preparing to unleash upon the world Book 2. Why did it take 10 years?
Well, I'm working on a project that has taken, in effect, 25 years to complete, from its inception all the way to its fruition. I released Book 1 in 2015, in part because I had run out of funding to support the experiments for this particular exercise. And of course, I needed to be able to provide some sort of evidence of the outcomes from all of that effort. And as a consequence, decided that I needed to publish the first half of my achievement just to make sure that the world knew I was still a poet, still writing, still publishing material. But I had reached a particular milestone in the conduct of that experiment, but it was still incomplete. And consequently, it's taken a subsequent 10 years after that initial publication to bring the project to its ultimate success. And that's why there's been a prolonged delay between the publication of Book 1 and the publication of Book 2. I think that if I had done this with greater facility, I would probably want both books to be published under a single title and a single cover. But circumstances conspired against me doing so. And I wanted to be sure that at the very least, people could see the work in progress. But now they get to see the conclusion of the entire enterprise. So I'm looking forward to the publication of the book later this year, simply gratified that I managed finally to accomplish what for many people looked like a completely impossible task.
Yeah, well, it also completely flies in the face of the standard publishing schedule for professional writers, right? You would normally not allow 10 years to go by without a major publication. How has it been to maintain a profile as a poet and to maintain a sense of a professional presence despite the very long gap between books?
Well, I think I have prepared my audience for the fact that the books take a long time to produce. My very first book came out in the late 90s, and that took 4 years to write. The subsequent publication, a book entitled Eunoia, took 7 years to write. The book that followed upon that one took 15 years to write. And the book that has currently come out has now taken 25 years to write. So each of these intervals has become increasingly longer than its predecessor, probably on something that looks like a logarithmic scale or an exponential scale. And I would not recommend this particular publishing behavior to my peers or other poets. It's not great, but I did promise myself when I was a young man that I would do projects that were at the very limits of my aptitude, trying things that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish. And I think that is merely a side effect, a consequence of making that rather stupid decision as a young artist.
What do you think is it in your personality that causes you to rush headlong into these seemingly impossible projects that are enormously costly in terms of effort, but also in terms of expenditure to produce?
Probably as a way of distinguishing myself from my peers among poets, I've wanted to do things that are forthrightly ambitious, such that if you were to accomplish them, there would be not much cause for controversy about the merits of the achievement. In the world of poetry, failure is immediately presumed. Poets generally do not aspire, I think, to the grandeur of great success, even though historically, in its inception, poetry founded entire civilizations, entire religious traditions, probably was the great bastion of important cultural truths. But in the intervals since those ancient times, poetry has become less pertinent to our own cultural experience. And these kinds of projects that are difficult, I think, aspire to reassert the importance of poetry as a potential area of cultural investigation, especially in the early 21st century when science and technological achievement have become paramount to probably our own survival as a species. And I think poetry needs to be there, speaking very directly to those kinds of concerns with as much aptitude as possible. So I think that I've taken on board something that looked like a necessity. Normally, I think people become writers in part because the world is not serving to them the books that they would prefer to read. And I think that as a poet, I'm writing the books that I wanted to see in the world, but nobody else was writing. And as a consequence, I felt obliged then to fill that gap for myself and write the books I wanted to read.
We'll get to the particulars of this project, which are fascinating to say the least. But I just want to stay on this topic for a minute, because the level of ambition that went into these books is, I think, on a literary scale, comparable to some of the most extraordinary feats that have been accomplished in the hard sciences, for example. And that's not something that one spontaneously associates with the arts at present, right? I have a sense often that artists, and this doesn't pertain only to writing, but I think in a general sense, are aiming very low, very, very low. What is the bar that constitutes a sort of acceptable minimal degree of achievement in the arts these days? We've sort of accepted, it's sort of like managed decline, and we've sort of accepted that the default expected outcome is that the work will have a very limited and very brief reception, that it will not enact any kind of change or have any particular wider cultural resonance. And that provided that the artist has done a decent job of revealing their own personal demons, their feelings, their subjectivity, then the job of art has been served.
Yeah, I think that I would probably agree with most of those points, that there is something about the entire cultural apparatus, certainly its institutional framework, that disincentivizes outright Ozymandian ambition of the sort that would found a civilization in a desert and allow it to, be eroded over millennia. I mean, we don't tend, I think, to aspire to build cathedrals and starships and gigantic enterprises that might take generations to fulfill. Now, there are people currently, I think, who look like role models now for that kind of behavior, albeit they're, technocrats of one sort or another. They're, among an elite group of billionaires, perhaps. In the arts, I think there are high achievers who do things that are extraordinary, that require, the mobilization of immense resources in order to accomplish. But I'm merely a poet, and the cost of entry into the world of poetry is very low. The cost of risk is very low. And you might think that because the cost of entry and risk is so low, people would be all the more happy to indulge in the most lavish experimentation because the outcome of that risk is, and the cost of it is very low. Whereas if I'm a Damien Hirst and I'm building the treasures from the wreck of the unbelievable, I'm spending $100 million to fake an archaeological find in the middle of the ocean. I have to build all of these objects out of expensive materials using the finest craftsmanship and put myself at immense risk financially in order to accomplish this outrageous task that is just a work of magic, right? It's tantamount to a work of magical stagecraft. That's a costly endeavor. And perhaps there's some fear of risk involved in all of that. You would like to be able to know that at the end of that enterprise, you might be able to recoup some of that outlay of energy. In poetry, the outlay is so low that I would think you might be consequently incentivized to do the most outlandish thing, to really try things that are effectively impossible, or do things that you would do purely for the experimental delight of the outcome, surprising yourself. And yet that does not seem to pertain. It's not true these days. I think poets are among the least risky of all the artists, at least for now. These complaints I'm drawing are probably cyclical. I have joked on many occasions that it is bad to be an experimental artist, an experimental poet, in an odd-numbered decade. It's great to be an experimental artist or a poet in an even-numbered decade. But in an odd-numbered decade, it's very bad. And I would say that certainly in the 20-teens, it's been very bad to be a poet. It's perilous and dangerous and tough. But by comparison, in the aughts, there was a great deal of optimism about poetry, at least among the experimental writers. We were having more fun. There was a great deal of play and willingness, I think, to try things that were unprecedented and to make claims that were outlandish in an effort to demonstrate our aptitudes. There's probably cycles at play here in backlashes to particular kinds of attention. But I stand by the claim that poets probably are ignoring the most pertinent features of their society. It still strikes me as unbelievable that even though we have put human beings on the surface of the moon 50 years ago, there still is not a single canonical poem about that event, even though it's probably the most important thing that any life form on this planet has done, right? To actually deliberately escape the gravity well and deliberately set foot on an alien world. Probably as important as crawling out of the ocean, 500 million years ago, right? Those are the first astronauts, those theropods who, crawled onto a beach. I think that, we are currently at that moment witnessing, something equivalent to theropods crawling out of the ocean onto the beach, right? There's an important evolutionary shift taking place at this very moment. And yet, even though we are indulging in what might amount to intercontinental battles and extraterrestrial voyages that would be the envy of the Greek gods, we still have not got a 12-volume epic about it. Right? There's no great Iliad about our trip to the moon. There's not even a canonical work of lyrical poetry about that experience, not one. And yet I find that dismaying. I think it's just impossible to imagine. I would like poetry, I think, to be more pertinent to its circumstances. One way or the other. I mean, I'm citing what seems like a very personal, problem. But
well, you could argue that other media have jumped into the fray, right? To pick up the slack. Films, for example, which are massively popular, infinitely more so than poetry, and have in fact eulogized and paid tribute to these epoch-defining civilizational achievements.
Sure, but I also think that poetry can compete favorably against those other alternatives, but has chosen not to. Now, again, one of my jokes I might make is that, of course, every day I'm losing my market share to online porn. Like, I mean, this, right? I mean, as a poet,
that is a contest you will not win.
There are certain kinds of contests that are probably difficult to win, but there is a magic and kind of epiphany or euphoria that you can derive from poetry, and you don't get it anywhere else except perhaps in music. And I would suspect that for many consumers today, where they in fact get a hit of poetry is primarily in other art forms, probably music first, but there's poetry everywhere. It's incipient in our environment. It's throughout our linguistic experience of the mediascape. It's just that we don't identify it there. We don't point to it. I think for poetry, Elvis has left the building. We are standing and applauding in an empty auditorium, congratulating ourselves, even though what constitutes a poetic experience is happening elsewhere.
Okay. So it looks like you associate that with a decline of risk-taking, a decline in terms of experimentation, and also the scale of ambition. Why are those two things necessarily correlated, right? Because if you look on the great canonical works of literature or music, there's a kind of bifurcation, you might say. There are artists who are more consolidatory, if I can, that's probably a coinage, and others who are more extravagant and willing to explore the limits of the fertile land, so to speak. One is not necessarily better than the other, but you are arguing in favor of experimentation as a value in and of itself.
Sure, I think experimentation is a value in and of itself in the same way that play is a value in and of itself. And if art is an expression of that value of play, then it probably has an autonomy that shouldn't be colonized by other interests. And it's like one of those places where minds can go to daydream and figure out alternatives, right, to the current paradigms of thinking. Art is an Area 51, where we go and study an alien technology called language, or whatever your medium might be. But in the case of poetry, we're studying language and treating it as something probably alien to us in an effort to reverse engineer it for truly human purposes. I'd like to think that I'm trying to turn language into a kind of anti-grav machine or a time machine or a dimensional portal, like something that's probably buried, deep in the desert of Nevada, right, and has, founded a breakaway civilization, probably, right, of people who have a kind of advanced or intimate understanding of something really strange. Poets, could conceivably imagine themselves doing something like that. And certainly when I was a young man, I thought that if I was a poet, I'd be hanging out with some of the wildest minds. But no, I'd say if you're a physicist or a mathematician, you're probably hanging out now with the wildest minds, rather than the poets. The poets, by comparison, at least certainly over the last 10 years, are among the most hidebound variety of people contributing to culture. At least by comparison to other alternatives. It just seems to me that poetry is diminished in its vision of the world. Again, I have joked that poets continue to write about the trivia of their marital divorces, even though robots are currently taking pictures of orange ethane lakes on Titan. I mean, you actually have a surreal, imaginary landscape that is truly strange and should be the product of imagination, but is currently real, right? Something that you could witness from the comfort of your armchair, right? You have a kind of godlike perception now of the neighborly cosmos that we would never have had before, and yet it does not seem to have impacted upon the world of poetry. Poets continue to write as though the internet was never invented, as though it doesn't exist. Poets will insist that they can continue to write as they do now, even though artificial intelligence is outstripping their capacity to contribute text to the economy. I'm a bit dismayed, I think, by the unwillingness of people to understand that right now there's an immense opportunity for all the arts, but poetry in particular, to say something truly wonderful and amazing and strange about the world at large. But for whatever reason, most poets have chosen not to. Right? They don't want to. It seems a very strange thing to me. I don't understand that really. The Xenotext, for example, exists in part to scare my friends and rivals out of a certain complacency, I think, to show them what they really could aspire to do, whether it would be efficacious for me to have done an experiment like that in order to demonstrate to others what they could conceivably do, right? Rather than become the poet you should be, try to become the poet you could be.
Well, it's not hard to come up with reasons not to do what you've done.
Sure. Oh, yeah. So, but let me tell you, I understand that there's very good reasons not to try. Like there's very good reasons not to try. If I had understood really how hard what I was doing could turn out to be, I may have thought twice about it. I may not have invested time and energy, but there's a lot of sunk cost, right? I've pushed every poker chip onto the table, and the bet I've let it ride for as long as I can, playing the hand I've been dealt. And at the very least, I can say that unlike other poets who have failed and try to make a virtue of that failure, transform it into something edifying, which I think is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, so long as it doesn't actually indemnify failure as an aspirational goal. I think, in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus, of course, is expected to fail. He is supposed to go to hell in an effort to resurrect his lost love. And we are meant to understand that poetry can never do that. It can aspire perhaps to bring back a phantom for a little bit, but never, truly bring the person back to life. You fail. And I really wanted to be Orpheus capable of dragging Eurydice into the light, like without looking back over my shoulder in doubt, and then having the thing fail before my eyes, watch it wither away. I'd like to think that probably at great cost, and with a lot of sacrifice, I've managed nevertheless to bring Eurydice into the light for a little while, right? Succeed, in this hellish misadventure.
The Xenotext. Orpheus. Any style of life is prim. Oh, stay, my lyre. With wily ploys moan the riff of any tune aloud. Moan now my fate. In fate we rely. My myth now is the word of life. Eurydice. The fairy is rosy of glow. In fate we rely. Moan more grief with any loss. Any loss is the achy trick. With him we stay. Oh, stay, my lyre. We wean him of any milk. Any milk is rosy.
Right. Well, the obvious corollary to massively scaling your ambition is that the probability of failure is far likelier.
Sure.
Right. And that frightens people.
Sure. And as I've said before, in most cases, though, a poet is not putting much at risk, right? You just have to have pen and paper, really. A few books, maybe. You don't have to buy a Stradivarius. You don't need necessarily decades of lessons. You don't actually have to put yourself at such risk that a mistake could condemn you, right, forever in your career. Whereas, the great thing about poetry is probably among the more demotic of art forms, and many people imagine that they could do it without associating the effort with a great investment of energy and time. And I would say that now it might be incumbent upon poets to reflect upon that a little bit, to readjust expectations, perhaps, especially at this moment when poetry might find itself really threatened by technological advancement. The advent of the internet has been an immense boon, I think, to the possibility of poets becoming important cultural figures, but their capacity to thrive in the environment may be threatened by the advent of superintelligent machines, right? Who may succeed at classing us in all of the the traits that make us most human.
Well, it's possible that the fine arts will simply go to those places that are no longer accessible to AI, that cannot be modeled by them.
Yeah, I don't think that the machines are getting stupider. Like I think they can only get smarter. Like that. The thing is that unlike the poets, machines are getting smarter. Right? The poets probably are if anything getting dumber by comparison. Right.
Right. But the machines don't have embodied intelligence. right?
Not yet. Like I say, like every one of these things that we keep moving the goalposts on these grand achievements of our successors, and I can't think of anything that humans do that a machine could not conceivably do sometime in the probably near future. And I don't think poetry is best insulated from it. I would like to be able to write a poem that would appeal to a future machine. I think I would like to be able to participate in whatever complex hybrid culture we end up having to collaborate or construct with these creations. I'd like to be able to know that whatever I did was pertinent to that environment, that it spoke to it, in a manner which was compelling and convincing. I'd like to think that a project like the Xenotext, in its ambitions, persists, both metaphorically and quite literally, as an artifact, in the imagination of humanity and its successive cultures.
Well, you have said that a lot of contemporary art, a lot of modernism, suffers from a fatal overdose of seriousness. Mm-hmm. Right. This is a problem that is very widespread. In fact, I remember when I was a student, I had a very perceptive teacher who pointed out that a great deal of contemporary composition is dispiriting. A lot of it is sort of merely putting on the costume of disorder, fragmentation, and rather negative in its fundamental emotional orientation, you might say. And there's a kind of grayness, a kind of homogeneity about that. Mm-hmm. And what you've done from the very outset of your career, I would say, is to show that experimentation need not result in work of that sort at all. In fact, on the contrary, your work is consistently, it has a gorgeous surface quality. Musically, it's extremely beautiful. It's very elegant. It's accessible. It's not really obscure. Once you understand the premise, the concept, it's not difficult of access, right? And so there's a surface level to it that is immediately seductive and appealing. And I would think that would be a Darwinian trait that artists would trip over themselves to adopt. Instead, what I often see is that the surface is dismissed or thought of as secondary or unimportant. And so in your work, this very high level of ambition, this conceptual extravagance is allied with this extraordinary elegance and beauty, and it takes the form of an invitation, right? So tell me a little bit about that, because that is not the default position for a lot of artists.
Sure. Well, I think I agree with most of the comments that you've made about the inheritors of modernism, that if there is something to the notion of the pleasure of the text, something formulated by Roland Barthes, the jouissance that a reader is supposed to extract from the experience of reading, my peers are very invested in that idea, I think, about the jouissance in a text. But they reserve that pleasure for themselves, not for their audiences. And in fact, part of the pleasure that you might have as one of these kinds of avant-garde artists is the pleasure of knowing something that nobody else knows, right? Like having access to an obscure or hermetic or erudite kind of knowledge that nobody else has access to. There's this, I know something you don't know, right? Whether it be a particular set of skills or a particular set of initiation rituals into a hieratic form of music or art or whatever. It's tantamount to being the kind of stage magician who delights in having a secret and displaying their aptitude in the presence of a secret without divulging it, right? Without, affording others the pleasure of experiencing it. So there's an impulse in most of my work to ensure that there are as many entrances into it as possible and as many exits, fire exits as possible, so that even if you don't understand portions of it or aspects of it, you can nevertheless extract something of value from it that might appeal to you individually. I'd like to imagine that most of the work affords that kind of faceted opportunity for people to find purchase in it, to see for themselves a kind of handhold somewhere within it. Part of the exercise in all of these cases, of course, is that it would be easier to fulfill the expectations of this particular conceptual constraint, for example, and not make it beautiful or elegant. It would be the parameters of available options are wide open when I don't have to worry about any other kind of aesthetic feature, no matter how superficial it might appear to be. But if I then subsequently demand that it be musical in its structure, or that it have these attractive aesthetic qualities, then I've amplified some of the difficulty and virtuosity of it. I want the work to feel unlabored, even though you know that there is a superhuman amount of athleticism that is underpinning the exercise. You would like it to look effortless, I think, if you can, right? Certainly, we admire, I think, athletes who make it look easy, right? We admire people who seem to not demonstrate that it's required, decades of expertise and aptitude in order to accomplish something. We want the sleight of hand to be invisible, if we can, right? It would seem to me that also by doing so, we pay honor to the medium and the form. We're demonstrating a willingness to play, and that the play is itself serious. But I don't think that much reverence should be given to others, at least insofar as we accord them respect because of the lessons that they've provided us, right? Not because that they constitute permanent models that have to be emulated. I would simply say, look, I admire these people who are extraordinary in part because they offer me permissions. They grant me opportunities that I would not have otherwise had. They've shown me, I could do that. Why did I not think to do that? Surely I can see now that that's an obvious move on the board, and I'm too stupid to have noticed. I really should have thought of that myself, right? I want to feel that way every time I look at something, by a person I admire. I wish I had done it.
Well, an experience I had recently, and I'd really like to know if this resonates for you.
Sure.
I gave a talk talking about aesthetics, about art, about beauty, and about the role of the arts in today's society. And one of the comments I made was that in Mozart's operas, you have the extraordinary flash of brilliance, which is the coming together of a savant style and a popular style.
Yes.
And they fuse together brilliantly. And these moments are comparatively rare in the history of art music, because composers tend to tilt more in one direction or the other.
Sure.
Right. And so when that does occur, when you have the greatest, what would you say, accessibility, the greatest seduction on one level, and also the most extravagant sophistication at the same time, that's powerful.
I would think so. Yes. I mean, certainly it resonates with me. I mean, obviously, I'm impressed by the precedent of Mozart. Look upon his contribution as a singularity, an important feature of the human experience. Right. That you understand it makes humanity valuable because despite scientific endeavor being potentially rediscoverable if it's forgotten or lost, right? We could probably reconstitute it, right, and discover it again. There's no way, right, that we're ever going to be able to revisit or reproduce anything that Mozart might have, stumbled upon in the course of his own, expression of himself. That's a unique feature of the human, endeavor, human achievement. And given its extraordinariness, something that is worth conserving as much as we can. I would like to think that humanity at its best warrants some conservation, an attempt to ensure that it endures, rather than, as is probably favorable now, finding cause to dismiss it. In my own life as a teacher in the academy, many teachers now, of course, provide instruction in literature, and most of the lessons are about finding fault with it to some degree or another, right? To see them as the great works of our tradition as symptomatic of probable forms of oppression or some default problem in our culture, and that they all are symptomatic of it and consequently dismissible. Rather than cultivating an admiration for some of the excellence that they dramatize or demonstrate. It seems to me that many people, at least initially, show up to take courses in the arts in part because they would like to have their awakening, this kind of enlightenment about the greatness of the past, the greatness of our best people, illuminated. So they could know how to do it themselves. But if you find fault with it all for whatever reason, right? If it's merely an expression of, buzzwords, catchphrases, that they're expressions of colonialism or capitalism or supremacism, whatever the fault might be,
oppression, power, etc.
Yes, whatever the fault might be, then there's no incumbency upon you to equal them. Right, to transcend them, right, to in some sense regard them as models that might require successorship, right? That you probably, if you want to participate in the human project, you have to do something that is as good as or comparable, or at least makes an innovative contribution to it, right? Like pursues an avenue of exploration that nobody else has done, and you'd like to be able to understand that they constitute a set of permissions, right? That despite whatever frailties or faults we might find with them, that they offer you a kind of bastion against a lot things that are a lot worse than them, right? I mean, that to me is why you would want to know about it. And I say this as an avant-garde, poet, the kind of person, who is supposed to really wander through the museum with a kerosene can, right, and a lit match, right? Like there's something, that characterizes, right, the experimental tradition that is supposed to, deny the merits of the past in an effort to make room for the present or the future, right? And that a poet, an avant-garde poet, is supposed to be out of sync with their own time frame, right? You show up in the time machine either before your time, right, and as a consequence are trying to goad people into the future, or you show up, after your time, in which case then you have to impugn people for, the fact that they have forgotten or lost an opportunity, right, a road that they could have pursued, that in the past and forgot about. You never show up of your time in the avant-garde, right? The job of the avant-garde is to make sure that you show up for the future on time. Right, there are things to be done. You better get done as quick as you can, right? Because the future is coming fast. And I would like to think that that it's important to do that because of the great achievements from the past.
Right. Well, yes, you don't get to the future without some awareness of the past. Of where you've come from.
Yeah.
I would think that would be straightforwardly obvious.
Well, it's not if you're young. I mean, I think if you're a young artist, you look at the past with immense trepidation, right? I mean, there are a lot of giant pyramids and ziggurats and monoliths and obelisks, in the way, right? These things are titanic barriers, right? I mean, there's a pantheon. If you'd like to join it, right, you have to be kind of godlike, right, to participate. And undoubtedly, that's an intimidating feature, right? But it's true almost of any endeavor, right? If I want to become a basketball player, if I wanted to become the world's greatest golfer, I do have to compete against the likes of a Tiger Woods. I have to somehow understand that person provides a model, even if only so that I know what the competition is doing, I suppose, like what kinds of tasks I have to perform in order to succeed. I mean, most people, I don't think, understand the kinds of sacrifices and effort and exertion required to be successful at anything, like even moderately successful. I mean, they don't understand the amount of effort required. Some people give us some insight into that. There's a few billionaires right now who show us, what hard work can do. But even just the smallest triumphs of everyday life, right? Getting up and going to the gym or going to work, right? I don't know, doing a job in something that you don't want to do, right? In an effort to actually accomplish things that you have to do. That requires a lot of grit and an aspiration to excellence that is probably beyond your immediate reach.
Well, and a belief in the future, because if you were genuinely nihilistic, you wouldn't get out of
bed. We don't teach our students right now to imagine that the future will be better than the past, and there's good reason to believe that it will be. I mean, much more reason, in fact, to believe that it will be much better than the past. But it is now, I think, considered a sign of urbanity and sophistication to imagine that the world has gone to hell irreparably, and that you gain some sort of stature by being cynical enough to report on that constantly, rather than to contribute, I suppose, to the betterment of the world by making things or solving problems, right, for others, right? Even by just simply improving yourself, right?
Right.
Like a small thing, right? I don't know, tidying up, your own environment.
That's not trivial. That's hard to do.
It can be very hard to do, and I would say these modest gains that people, even now fail to do, right, testify to, the importance of having ambitions, no matter how modest. And then in doing your best to improve upon those aspirations, right? To have longer horizons for investment in the future. I mean, if we don't have long horizons, we don't go to Mars. Right. If we don't go to Mars, we don't go to Alpha Centauri. I would like to live long enough to see a nearby star live. Like, I'd love to be able to go and actually see, another star, but that requires very long horizons, right? I have to be able to survive for 1,000 years. I don't know.
Right.
I'd have to have, a pretty good, 401k, investment account, right? I'd have to be the kind of engineer who imagines that, building a cathedral is worth the effort, even though I might be dead long after people worship in it, right? So there's something about a project like the Xenotext, which is attempting to model a behavior I wish I could see more of among my peers.
Right. Okay. So what you have done, and speaking of personal goals and bettering oneself and so on, so you've attempted to encode a poem into a deathless bacterium.
Yes.
And in fact, you've succeeded at it. So
yes, a couple of times I've succeeded at it.
Okay, Okay. So give us the grand tour of the Xenotext project and what it constitutes.
All right. For fear of boring your listeners, I have some patter to convey that back in the year 2001, I discovered a couple of articles about how we might communicate with extraterrestrial civilizations, and the content of those articles inspired me to imagine writing a poem through a rather difficult set of constraints, in such a way that I could encipher the poem as a sequence of genetic nucleotides. And then with the assistance of a laboratory, we could build that gene in a lab and then implant it into the genome of a bacterium, effectively replacing part of its genetic code with my poem, so that the organism would in effect be the living embodiment of my text. Now, lots of scientists and artists have subsequently demonstrated that you can encipher textual information, all kinds of media, into the genomes of bacteria, and then subsequently reconstitute that information, sequence the genome and extract that information. But in my case, I've made the task a little more difficult, because I've written the poem in such a way that when it's enciphered as a gene, the organism can in fact read the information and misinterpret it in effect as a set of instructions for building a protein. And a protein consists of a long string of amino acids, just a string of molecules hanging off a charm bracelet, if you like. And that sequence of amino acids likewise enciphers a totally different poem that also makes perfect sense and speaks back to mine. So in effect, I've genetically engineered a bacterium so that it becomes not only an archive for storing my poem, it becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And that's the innovation that I bring to bear upon a technology that other scientists and artists have already begun to perfect. Now, as crazy as all of that might sound, the true punchline to the whole story is that the host I've selected to house these two poems is a bacterium that is a very ancient organism. It has this superpower permitting it to repair its own damaged DNA very quickly. And as a consequence, it's very resistant to mutational drift. It doesn't change. It doesn't alter under conditions of duress. It fixes itself pretty fast. And for this reason, of course, it would make a pretty enduring repository for information, because it maintains its integrity. But normally, if a bacterium doesn't mutate or change, it can't adapt and consequently cannot evolve. And normally, such organisms go extinct. But this one is already so well adapted to the utter lethality of the universe that it does not need to change. It's a kind of evolutionary dead end, really. It's not going to evolve into something that has a space program and produces operas like those by Mozart. It's stuck. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it. It won't die. You can blast it with 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly obliterate a human being, and the organism can continue to live. It can survive even in the open vacuum of outer space. It really is widely regarded as one of the most unkillable things ever to have evolved on the planet Earth. And we don't know really what its natural habitat is, because there are none on the surface of the Earth that would drive its evolution into so weird a niche. And as a consequence, some scientists, I think, have speculated very extravagantly that the organism may have spent at least part of its terrestrial evolutionary history off the surface of the Earth, probably in the local orbit of the planet, perhaps blasted off the Earth on an asteroid or something, and then was subsequently returned to the earthly environment. We find it everywhere. It's in gneissic stones in Antarctica. It's in the fecal matter of elephants in Bangladesh. We don't know really where it's supposed to live. It was discovered in tins of meat that were irradiated in the 1950s by a scientist attempting to prolong the shelf life of meat for use by the military in atomic bunkers or in rocket missions. And as a consequence, the military has taken a very deep interest in the survivability of these organisms, probably in the hope of being able to exploit some of those aptitudes for the benefit of soldiers in the field of battle. But by putting my poem in this particular organism, something that's like an old dragon, like a weird wee god, I'd effectively be writing a book that could conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization, and it might be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. I've deliberately attempted to write a book that might conceivably last forever, literally. And right now, in a petri dish, in a laboratory at the University of Texas, Austin, there is in fact a sample of this organism on ice, which might conceivably hold in its genetic information a poem that would outlast us all.
I've heard this before, but I'm speechless nevertheless, because it's so insane. It's so unbelievable. Okay, so conceiving of such a project in the abstract, I could imagine. What was it like to actually develop this project? You mentioned that this has taken 25 years. Mm-hmm. So what were the steps that you had to take, the problems that you had to solve in order to?
Oh, there are innumerable obstacles.
This could very easily have been a fanciful, what if kind of scenario, but you've actually done it.
Yes. I read these articles when I was a young man, and to me, the fantasy that was kind of conceived in these scientific articles looked to me plausible enough to imagine doing. Had I known how hard the project might be, I probably wouldn't have embarked on it so cavalierly. But part of the artistic exercise, of course, is to acquire sufficient expertise so that I'd be capable of doing the genetic engineering and the protein engineering myself. So I had to, of course, immerse myself in these sciences with sufficient degree of aptitude that I'd be able to convince scientific partners to collaborate on applications for grants and forms of cooperation that would permit me to realize the project. And that took a long time. It was a very long period, 6 to 8 years of effort required to master some of these skills in a manner which would make it possible for me to bring to bear some samples of work in progress, to scientists, so that I could convince them that I was capable of conducting these experiments and designing these investigations. So that was a big hurdle to cross. Was convincing peers in the scientific community that I was a credible collaborators.
So how did you do that? I mean, what were those conversations like?
Well, they are tantamount to sitting down with somebody after politely asking for an opportunity to give them an elevator pitch, and then demonstrating a plan that shows that I have thoughtfully anticipated objection, right, and that I can demonstrate that I have credibility and aptitude. In part, showing that I don't have a high degree of dilettantism about this, that I was really informed. I did have the pleasure of sitting with one scientist who was so impressed with the conversation that he felt that he was having a more sophisticated conversation about bioinformatics with me, despite me simply being an English major, than he would otherwise feel comfortable having with his own PhD student who was working the bench outside his office. I found that response flattering because it meant that I had overcompensated for my own ignorance. And in fact, I've had occasions where I've been presented with information in a laboratory setting. I've been shown somebody's work, or have been given say a genetic sequence that has been modified to accommodate an experimental constraint, and I've had to correct error. And to me, that's worrying because I'm actually entrusting myself to the expertise of people who are supposed to be far more informed than me, and I would have to then actually question the legitimacy of a claim they've made about the work and say, no, I think this is a mistake. Can we check this again? And they would insist, of course, there was no error. Only, of course, eventually to discover that there really was mistakes in the construction of the experiment. That's a little bit worrying because I really don't trust myself well enough to imagine that I have the expertise required to fulfill many of the difficult features of this work. But that would have been, for sure, the first hurdle to overcome, was finding partners who were willing to participate and ensuring that I could credibly ask for money to assist in subsidizing the experiments. And this is 15, 20 years ago. The cost of those experiments was high. I mean, the technology and its costs have become more accessible and easier to fulfill in the interim over 25 years. Those costs have fallen dramatically. I mean, but because of the free market and competition and scientific and technological innovation and advancement, it's quite incredible to me now that just how accessible and easeful it is to conduct these kinds of experiments, whereas before it was much, much harder.
Right.
A lot harder. In addition, I had to write these two poems, and they're written according to a very, very difficult constraint. You have to imagine, in effect, solving a particular kind of bizarre cryptogram. In Sunday newspapers, you might have a little logic puzzle. You're given a cryptic message that looks nonsensical, but if you analyze its letter patterns and letter frequencies and provide, some canny substitutions, you can decipher the message that is apparently in this nonsensical sequence of letters, finding an intelligible little aphorism. And as a kid, I would, solve these Sunday puzzles as a kind of leisurely exercise. But I used to wonder why the designer of the puzzle didn't actually give us a meaningful sentence, one that, made perfect sense, except that if you analyzed its letter patterns and letter frequencies, you could conceivably swap out each one of those letters with a cognate letter that would in fact show you the intended coded message. But wouldn't that be a great disguise, right? To send a perfectly meaningful message such that somebody would never know that it actually contained an enciphered message. Normally, when an enciphered message looks like nonsense, and maybe if you're a spy, you go, well, that's interesting. I probably have to study that more closely. But you might ignore a message that seems to say something innocuous, but in fact contains embedded within it an intended but encoded message. So now I understand why the puzzle designers don't do that.
Right, their salaries were probably...
I understand why they don't do that. As it turns out, that particular fantasy is very difficult to fulfill. Now, in this case, you have to imagine, say, producing a cipher, a way of pairing off letters of the alphabet, doing so that they're mutually encoded. So, say, for example, wherever you have an A, you can substitute a T, and vice versa. You can substitute T for A for T. Where you have an N, you can substitute an H for N or N for H, right? They're mutually correlated. Imagine, pairing off all the letters so they're mutually correlated in this manner. And it's a constraint on how you would encipher the alphabet. Knowing that there are about a little shy of 8 trillion ways of doing that. Okay, there's 8 trillion ciphers in which you can pair off all the letters of the alphabet, so they're mutually correlated. Now, pick one of those ciphers, maybe using some sort of heuristic that permits you to write a text in such a way that if you were to swap out every letter in the text and replace it with its cognate from this, mutually bijective cipher, you produce a new text that also makes sense and is just as beautiful as the first one. As it turns out, there are no possible ways of doing this. Out of all of the 8 trillion available ciphers, none of them can generate anything of any poetic merit. You could have all kinds of nonsensical, bizarre work, but nothing elegant, nothing beautiful, right? I could produce all kinds of, fragmentary, mosaics of words. I could probably generate something that would be ugly and strange, but nothing that would be intelligible, meaningful, and dare I say beautiful. Only one, as it turns out, of all of these 8 trillion ciphers can generate a poem that makes perfect sense in such a way that it produces another poem that also makes perfect sense, and that they're topically and thematically correlated.
It's spooky. It's as though someone put it there.
It feels like somebody put it there, that it is in fact a direct feature of the constraints of this mutually bijective cipher, with respect to the alphabet, and the available repertoire of words in the English language. Out of all of the 8 trillion options, only one works. And for me, there's something fragile about that notion, because we live in a galaxy perhaps where there might be 8 trillion worlds orbiting billions of suns. And so far as we can tell, all of them are deserts, barren, probably lifeless, and so far as we can see, given our limited perception, there's only one universe, one planet, so to speak, in which life thrives, in which there is, in fact, any poetry. Right? Out of all of these 8 trillion ciphers, there is only one world where a poem can exist. And I found it. I found it embedded, in that. It took 4 years of effort to find it. And I was getting very worried that it might be impossible after 4 years of searching. I was committed to fulfilling an experiment. I was given some money, and of course,
what made you think it was possible? Because what you're describing is so extraordinarily, astronomically unlikely.
Yeah.
That it's entirely conceivable that your efforts would have been entirely in vain.
Yes.
So what made you think that it was even in the realm of the possible?
I have done very difficult tasks with the language in the past, and the language has never let me down. I mean, it has proven resistant and difficult, but language has always shown to me that it is in fact quite elastic and capable of accommodating the duresses under which I might put it. Admittedly, I was very worried that I couldn't find it. I was working through very large vocabularies. I used a set of heuristic techniques that permitted me to get very large vocabularies. I think the largest was a little shy of 700 words. But none of them could be matched up in such a way to produce intelligible sentences, phrases. I mean, I was lucky if I could even get 2 intelligible phrases. It'd be a very, very rare occurrence, and nothing with any poetic merit. Yeah, and I would started winnowing down those vocabularies. Fine, these large ones aren't working. I have to go to the next tier of sizes, and be down to vocabularies that are only 300 words or 200 words. Right? The natures of these ciphers would be reductive of the vocabulary. There's not a lot of words that can fit the constraint of this particular encoding. And the one that finally worked is just a little over 100 words available. That's its repertoire. And yet it's sufficiently useful enough that I was able to write 2 poems that have merit. But that's getting very close to checking out. 100 words. The smaller the vocabularies get, the greater the likely constraints, of course, upon my options. And as it turned out, I was worried that there were no options. At this point, I would imagine that they would not occur. So finding the poems, I thought, would be the hardest part of this. I didn't expect it to be I thought this particular task would be the hardest part, and then I could just subsequently do the science, which would be relatively straightforward in my mind. That is not how things transpired. As it turns out, the 4 years I invested in the production of these poems was, by comparison, an easy task. The scientific components of it are much, much harder.
Right. Well, okay. 1 in 8 trillion. Okay. And that was the easy part. You haven't made things easy for the translator who would who would do a French version of the.
No, I don't think you could conceivably do it without going through the same hellishness I had to undergo. I think translating it into a French cognate would be challenging. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Probably, I would just say, look, if you do something that rivals this in another language, I would be very impressed. You would be my best friend for sure. I would just regard you as an outright genius.
Right.
Yeah. But as it turns out, it's not the hardest part of the exercise. Translating those poems, then, one of the poems has to be written in such a way that it not only fulfills this kind of complementary genetic structure, it has to likewise result in a viable protein that can persist in the cell long enough to be detectable and characterizable without damaging the organism. It has to be a viable protein.
So the ciphers that you spent 4 years were the easy part.
Yeah, the poem, by comparison, was much easier than the subsequent work on the protein. I had to write these 2 poems in such a way that they conform to this kind of genetically bijective relationship, so that the 2 poems were perfectly complementary, letter by letter. But the poem that the organism produced had to be able to be enciphered as a protein that could fold up into a viable structure capable of persisting in the cell without being destroyed, could persist long enough to be detected and characterized so you could actually read the poem. And this required a lot of educated guesswork, because at the time, being able to predict how a protein would fold up from its amino acid sequence was regarded as the hardest problem in biology. Imagine a sequence of amino acids, effectively like a bike chain, in which each of the elements is magnetized with a different polarity. And if you were to let it go, all of a sudden the elements of the bike chain kind of fold up and crunch up into a ball or something. And it'll always do that in the same way. It'll always produce the same structure. But we don't know very easily how that happens, how that transpires. So I have to design the poem such that if I start attributing amino acids to any of these given letters, that sequence of amino acids will in fact produce a protein capable of existing in the cell long enough for us to detect it. And as it turns out, that problem proved to be very intractable. It took many years for me to be able to propose a particular kind of protein sequence that looked plausible. And I'd had to borrow time on supercomputers in order to be able to simulate its outcome, to be able to guess, through some educated heuristics, whether it would be a plausible candidate to try, and then spend tens of thousands of dollars on the experiments, only to, of course, to discover that it wouldn't work. Right? That was, discouraging and difficult. And of course, I only have a few chances at trying. I can't, continue to just, work through this via trial and error. The number of options are very high. Let's put it that way. If I wanted to just simply translate the poem into amino acids, there are 140 characters in the resultant poem. It's kind of like a sonnet. It's got 14 lines of 10 characters per line, so to speak, but 140 elements in this particular poem. There are 20 amino acids. So the available, options for just assigning, amino acids at random to 140, elements is a little more than 1 novum quinquagentillion. It is the number 1 followed by 182 zeros, right? Something in that range. Okay, I might be off by an order of magnitude or two, but it is in that range. A number so extravagantly large that it's probably not enough seconds in the universe to count them out, right? In the lifetime of the entire, cosmos. It's an extraordinarily vast number. And my poem has to sit somewhere in that subset, if it exists at all. It's got to be in a subset of 1 novum quinquagentillion options. As it turns out, of course, the moment I assign a particular amino acid to any given letter, it then subsequently imposes other constraints upon what the neighboring, amino acids could be. And probably, again, the purely statistical correlations probably amount to about 8 trillion variations that I could conceivably, generate. So now, the odds of finding something correctly under these circumstances are at least 1 in 8 trillion squared. It's at least that unlikely. And I was thrilled that I finally managed to get the thing to work properly. Designed a protein that was optimized to function in a colony of E. coli. And that is a detour for the project. I had to get it to work first in a well-understood organism, right? Before I was allowed to work with a less well-understood organism. I have to do it first as a test of my aptitudes and credibility in a well-understood organism. So I have this immense distraction first. In order to accomplish this task, I've got to be able to prove that I can do it under these conditions, and I did. That bought me some credibility in order to try the experiment on Deinococcus radiodurans. So I re-optimized the design of this protein so that it could be enciphered in a style that organism would recognize. It's very odd to imagine that genetic sequences actually have stylistic features to them that some organisms prefer, right, over other kinds of styles. It could, it enciphers the same kind of protein, but some, organisms aren't going to like the way you've set it. They would prefer that you encipher that protein in a different way that's a little more optimal for it, right? That there are stylistic preferences. And being able to optimize that so that it would work properly in Deinococcus radiodurans, had its challenges because it changes the nature or structure of the gene sequence itself. It could introduce errors, of particular intractable nature, in the structure of the DNA. Makes it harder for it to be manufactured, or makes it more likely it'll disintegrate, something like that. I mean, there's an immense number of subsidiary constraints that get imposed upon the project as a side effect of just the technological limitations and the biochemistry itself, right? Trying to get the whole thing to work under these biochemical constraints, immensely difficult, right? And for a long time, I didn't know if it was possible because it failed. I got it to work in E. coli, couldn't get it work at all in the deathless bacterium. It was not feasible. And I ran out of money at that point. I ran out of options. And of course, then I have to invite more funding and subsidy. I have to rebuild partnerships that are now obsolete and disintegrated, and that took time. And you've asked me about obstacles that I had to overcome. I would say that as hard as those ones I've just described are, as Herculean and Sisyphean as they might have been, they pale in comparison to the hardships of trying to convince my peers in the arts to give me money. I mean that very seriously.
I can believe it.
I probably, not like, I might disagree with very good scientists and suggest that peer review is a terrible process, for assessing the merits of the arts and sciences. It in fact seems to me to be deliberately designed to hinder innovation and to render actual experimentation too difficult to warrant. It seems to me a conformity machine that prevents people from doing credible work that might actually change the world. It makes it harder, much harder. And
that's right. Well, academia generally, especially in as much as the arts are concerned, has become a gigantic conformity machine.
Yes, I would say so.
Absolutely.
And yet, ostensibly, they're supposed to, reward inventiveness, right? I mean, it's always framed as though we're rewarding cutting-edge, innovative, visionary, exercises. And I would say that from my experience, this has not been true. And it's very disheartening, especially in the arts, to be submitting artistic grant applications and being told no. And saying, look, if you just give me $25,000, I can finish this project, right? That's the cost of an experiment, right? I'm pretty close to finishing. And look, I've acquired a lot of expertise and I've hit all these benchmarks that indicate success, right? That I'm not case, right, who's asking for money, who has no credibility. I've actually been, discussed in Nature magazine. I've got a lot of credibility supporting the enterprise, and I'm very close to being able to finish it. I'd be delighted if you would just allow me to fulfill this immensely difficult task, right? Wouldn't you want to be able to say, we helped? And the answer's always been no.
What you needed was a vastly wealthy Calgary oil baron. I mean, that would have been the obvious place to look.
Well, I would also like, though, affirmation from my peers in the art world, in the world of poetry. I would like them to be able to say, yes, of course, but they never have, and they never did. Like the arts funding for this project was minuscule, like truly, unhelpful. Like what makes that especially distressing, right, is that I'd asked jurors, like, why didn't I get this funding? And the answer was always, well, it was very competitive, right? It was very competitive, round for funding. And I'm looking at them going, yeah, I know it was competitive because I showed up. Right. I mean, I knew it became competitive the moment I walked into the room. Right? Like, surely.
Yeah.
Well, everybody has to compete with me now. I'm not competing with them. Right? Right? That would be my, rather, hubristic joke, right? It would be, how I would respond to those claims and be going like, okay, well, 20 people got funding and I did not. I would like to know who these 20 geniuses are. I'd like to be able to meet them and become friends with them, right? I want to meet them, right? If they did something that exceeded this exercise, right? I'd like to know who they are because honestly, I don't know who they are. I'd love to meet them, right? And this has been an immense source of distress for me because I really could have used the funding at moments of real desperation. I could have used that affirmation, that support. It really was. I mean, this project took probably longer than it needed to, in part because support was not forthcoming from the people who profess to want innovative or kind of vibrant arts exercises, right?
Yeah. History provides ample examples of artists eating their own. I mean, this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, or maybe it's intensified.
But you would like to know that, hey, this has happened in the past. Let us not repeat our former errors. Let us not repeat these mistakes.
Optimistic.
I am optimistic. I'm saying, like, we know, right, that Van Gogh, cuts his ear off and dies, in deprivation, right?
Yeah, right.
Surely we would not want to subject geniuses to such, horrors again. Like those paintings that he made are now some of the most valuable objects ever produced by a human being. They're beloved by everybody on the planet, and yet he will not have reaped the rewards, of that adulation in his lifetime. And surely we would not want to repeat those kinds of mistakes over and over again. We would like to think that hey, if you're smart, you're well-educated, and really actually invested in the well-being of artists, that you would say, look, we want to be able to reward or incentivize ambitious, aspirational, work by people who are highly competent and meritorious.
Yes, I've thought about this. It's not obvious to me whether that may or may not be, in fact, an existential dilemma, one that cannot be resolved, one that is intrinsic to the artistic enterprise. The fact that the value of art is implicit, but it's rarely explicit, or it rarely manifests as such during the lifetime of the creator. And part of the reason for that is that, by definition, artistic creation involves pulling things out of the sea of potential, right? And by definition, such things are new. And what is new is difficult to categorize, right? And so it may be definitionally difficult, to say the least, for your peers to recognize.
I would say it's not definitionally difficult if you're an artist. Like, I would say, in spirit, truly an artist. Like, I'm looking for the new thing, right? I'm always where the experiment is happening. Like, that would be my immediate sense of openness to the novelty. If somebody's doing something new, I'm going to be fascinated or interested. The moment somebody says that's not poetry or that's not art, I'm going to perk up a little bit, because I want to know why suddenly we're excluding something right from the fold. I want to know, what permissions are afforded me by something I did not think to do. And if I look upon it and say, damn it, I wish I had thought of that. That idea is rightfully mine, right? Like, somebody has beaten me to a good idea, right? Right. Worse yet, squandered it, right? Actually done something truly, terrible with it. I'm going to be irritated. I really want to find the thing that people are doing that is inspirational and offers permissions. And if you're an artist, you know what those things are likely to look like paradigmatically, right? I mean, we all know what the most important kinds of things you should be doing in science typically are, right? I would like to be, working on, infinite energy and gravity propulsion and time machines. Like they all know that those would be really, really cool things, right? Like if somebody came along and actually, made an innovation that would, break the standard model and give us, a new set of physics,
okay.
right?
Those things have manifest utility, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't require a great leap of imagination
Right.
to contemplate what that would do for our species.
Sure.
With art, the best you can come up with is something like, art has utility in as much as it makes your life better.
Well, you got a set of techniques, new media, new ways of imagining how to be an artist. Now, the people who are distraught, right, by those models of innovation are not artists at heart. I would say that they're more like priests, and I'm probably bad-mouthing priests. I'm probably not giving priests their credit, right? But there is something of the commissar in those people. They are not at heart artists, because I think if you were, you would not create a world where Van Gogh cuts his ear off. Right? You wouldn't find yourself in that kind of situation, and you would do your utmost to correct it. You'd want to be on the ground floor of the innovative company, right? The startup. I'm saying if why not have invested immediately, right? In the hydrogen fuel cell, right? like whatever it might be. Surely you would want to enable that innovation, right? You'd want to be sure that you were there for it. And yet, bizarrely, no amount of suasiveness was enough to convince people, at least in the arts, to hand me money. I was able to get some support in the scientific community. All of whom were quite enthusiastic about the exercise when they saw its implications. They understood pretty quickly that I was rehearsing techniques that might be useful in preserving cultural information over epochal time against planetary disasters, against thermonuclear warfare or astrophysical barrage, any number of existential threats that might eliminate the grandeur of human civilization. And we have done things, I think, that should be protected, for all time. We're the only means by which the universe seems to be able to creep itself out, to think about itself. And that makes us pretty valuable, in my opinion. There is no other, so far as we can tell, sufficiently conscious species, that is allowing the universe to think out loud about itself. In most cases, I think the universe is one great secret that is supposed to be kept secret from itself, right? We're the means by which that secret is unveiled. And surely we would like to be able to reconstitute what we've learned or know if it were eliminated. I'd like to be able to understand that there's a kind of ethical dimension to the exercise as a way of demonstrating the importance of ensuring that we have something to say as a way of addressing the deep time of the cosmos. Now, we've done some exercises like that. We've got our Pioneer probes and our Voyager probes, which have messages aboard them that will outlast humanity, will outlast the sun, but are unlikely to be discovered. And they're useless if we want to reconstitute our own culture, right? We'd have to go and find them, right? And bring them back, right? If we lost whatever we have here, we'd have to go and search them out. But in this case, you could conceivably imagine archiving information in very durable repositories, including things like a life form. And so far as we can tell, there is no way really to preserve information over billions of years except through living things. In your own body are Hox genes for your body plan, which are so crucial to your survival that they have been pretty much preserved since time immemorial, since the invention of life itself, transmitted, from generation after generation into, the deep time of our current existence, and are generally unchanged. It's probably the only kind of information that has lasted that long. Right? So by doing an exercise of this sort, I'm trying to, I think, say to poets that we might have at our disposal now the opportunity to imagine addressing the deep time of the cosmos as a way of preserving humanity's greatest heritage, its legacy.
It's a beautiful thought. There's something poetically satisfying about the notion that even if we're not around to appreciate it, that it might be possible to encode the highest achievements of our species into something that could vastly outlive us, even if nobody ever discovers it, but it still exists in some form. I've had the thought at times. I remember once when I was a student, I was listening to a Mahler symphony, and I was listening to the grain, the beautiful grain of the double basses.
Sure.
The extraordinary depth of sound, and contemplating the centuries of development that had to go into developing equal temperament, developing these instruments so that they could be built, the playing techniques so that they could be played, the whole century-long, multiple century-long development of staff notation, of polyphony, of counterpoint, and so on, and thinking all of this could vanish. And that moment terrified me. I remember thinking, this beautiful sound, this low double bass note, could one day never be heard again.
Never be heard again.
And not only that, there would be no trace of it once having existed.
That's right. I mean, we don't know what things in the past sounded like. It seems to me a bit creepy to imagine, right, that you don't really know, what the roar of a dinosaur might have really sounded like. You may not know what the world sounded like. There's certain things that are so ephemeral as to disappear. And surely, there is probably some, dare I say, Ozymandian necessity, right, to make an effort to preserve it, even if it's going to be eroded, right, by the desert, by the wind of change, by entropy. It seems to me that life is ratcheting itself up against, right, those forces that would otherwise attempt to dismantle it. And poetry certainly was, for the longest time, a repository of cultural information in a world that had no writing, right? You'd have to sing the Iliad from one person to the next, right? You'd have to learn, 12 volumes of this epic poem in order to transmit your culture. Even now, in Aboriginal Australia, there are 40,000-year-old songs that are rehearsed and resung that permit you to navigate a hike across the entirety of that continent, right? As a map, right, that is orally transmitted through a song that would permit you to find your way across an entire continent. It would be tantamount to, singing a song to find your way to the moon. Like, to me, there's something, extraordinarily wonderful about the role that poetry plays in the preservation of culture. And in some respects, again, I just want poetry to speak as directly as possible to its current socio-technological concerns. People are very concerned about the extinction of our own species right now in a way that they weren't even 100 years ago. Right? I mean, at the dawn of the 20th century, at this time in the 20th century, we were all imagining what life would be like in the 21st century, right?
Well, most people were trying not to die immediately.
Well, it's true. I mean, yes, by comparison, right? They didn't have it as good. But they were fantasizing about life in the 21st century, right? There was Buck Roger fantasies about life in the 21st century. There is nobody currently now at the dawn of the 21st century going on what life will be like in the 22nd century. Buck Rogers in the 22nd century, right? Apart from, I don't know, a few billionaire technocrats.
That's partly because our time horizon has shrunk, and that's got to do with the increasing pace of technological development, right? So
partially, yeah.
Well, the 22nd century. How about 5 years from now?
Yeah, sure.
Right,
I mean, that's true. In the next 10 years, there will be more innovation and change than has occurred in the last 100. Right. And that would imply at that rate of change that, the 11th year from now, right, that 1 year will have as more change than the prior 10. Right. So, there's an accelerating dimension to the amount of future shock that we're going to endure. Sure. But and we're constantly, of course, given news about our impending doom of one sort or another. That we underestimate our ingenuity all the time and imagine that we're going to be defeated by climate change or any number of man-made disasters, thermonuclear warfare, machinic superintelligence, nanotechnology, biotechnology, all of these things, could pose existential threats. I note that they don't worry about existential threats that might be caused by poetry, and yet they are such existential threats, right? How many mind viruses, right, could we conceive of and currently constitute, dare I say, an existential threat, right now?
Oh yeah,
right?
Well, there's a rather widespread cultural conversation right now that centers around the deleterious effects of modernism.
Yeah.
And And that can't be dismissed out of hand, because modernism does have deleterious effects. So while I may not agree with the premise of the argument nor the conclusions, you can't deny that that compositions, poems, these things can be dangerous.
They could be. Yes, I mean, like it seems to me that what is currently happening in the West around the transmission of ideas indicates an existential threat, probably, to the current civilization. That let's put it this way, that there are probably in every single one of the disciplines a kind of Lovecraftian pit trap in all of them that poses an existential threat to humanity. And that, I don't know, maybe the first tripwire that we struck was discovery of the proton. Like all of a sudden now, that results in nuclear weapons, and you could and we don't, maybe I don't know, governments around the world would not like to rehearse that threat again, right? I mean, let's suppress all of the other potential pit traps that might arise in physics, right? And perhaps that's the reason we don't have anti-grav flying saucers. I'm not going to work in a flying saucer. But whatever conspiracy I might imagine around this, it seems to me that they're everywhere, right? They're there in biotechnology. I could create viral diseases that might wipe out humanity. They're there in computer science. I could design software that outclasses my own intelligence and threatens my survival on the planet. It could be in poetry. I found a religion. I found a bad group of mind viruses, right?
Well, this is the whole premise of Infinite Jest, the idea that it's possible to imagine a movie, a film, so hilarious that it's deadly, right?
Yes.
That you can use it to incapacitate your enemy.
Sure. I think that we can see evidence of that. The weaponization of propaganda, certainly, right? But I would be looking at right down to the kinds of stories that we seem to be telling ourselves that are evidently damaging, right, to cognition, and for which we are inadequately inoculated, right? Like that. I would like to think that my intelligence and education has insulated me a little bit against the worst thoughts that could damage my civilization. But in fact, that is the location where it's being transmitted, right? I mean, that's the petri dish where it's being manufactured, right? Like it's there, right? I don't know what to do about that. Apart from providing as many antigens as I can think of, but I would like to think that maybe the poetry that I'm producing is in some sense a balm against some of that, like an attempt to testify to the optimism of the human project, right? To speak to a future that is so far advanced from us that it's inconceivable, but a promise, right? It's an act of optimism about the future, sure. Right? I think that's what I would like people to see, when they look at this work, rather than the kind of apocalyptic dimension to it, the kind of infernal parts of it, the Miltonic excesses of its demonic character. There's a lot of that, of course, right? There's lots of explosions,
sure.
And
that
Michael Bay-like effects in it.
but that makes it exciting. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it exciting. There's the remark by David Lynch. He was asked why his movies are so dark, why they're so terrifying, why they deal with extreme psychological states, and he said, well, that's what you need, that to make a good story.
Sure.
If it was just bunnies dancing around, it would would not hold your attention for very long.
No.
So I want to come back to one thing, which is that you said in passing, but beauty had to be baked into this project.
Absolutely. Yes.
At the earliest stages of its conception, and that's not an obvious thing. The composer Morton Feldman has a remark that I'm going to quote in this context, which I love. He was hilarious and very quotable, but he talked about some of his more ideological colleagues who were driven by a belief in this or that technique or this or that procedure, which they would hold above the aesthetic dimension in terms of its importance. So in other words, it didn't necessarily matter what the piece sounded like, but it mattered a lot how you made it.
Sure.
And the quip that he had was something like, a surgeon comes out of the operating room and sees the the wife of the man who's just been operated on and says, "I've got good news. The operation was a complete success. Unfortunately, the patient died."
Yes.
The point being that you can succeed in doing what you've set out to do, but the patient can die.
Yeah.
The patient being aesthetics, beauty, whatever it might be. So that in itself is a remarkable thing. And both books of the Xenotext are eminently readable. They're exquisitely beautiful, right? And I think that's something that, well, viewers will have to discover for themselves when the book is released in June 2025. But those two things can coexist and ought to coexist. And that gives me hope. I think that's a ray of light.
Right.
That's a ray of light.
Well, it as I say, it's become customary among the avant-garde to imagine that beauty is not a privileged value.
Well, that it's orthogonal to innovation.
Yeah, that it would be orthogonal to innovation. Or that it reasserts some oppressive aesthetic demands. Right? That it's actually something deleterious to the work. Right, that being a beautiful person or having beautiful ideas, I don't know, constructing beautiful objects, is not in fact innovative, and yet it's very hard. Right, it seems to me that subscribing to the typical aesthetic values to make it beautiful, to make it sublime. Those values, which roughly correspond to making it something which you can fall in love with or be frightened by, right? Like in some sense, you're mixing these two things, these two sensations together to produce something really grand and awe-inspiring, is now regarded as utterly rebarbative and conservative, even, right? God forbid, right? I would say that because there's so much conformity around those attitudes, I say no. I promptly show up and say that's not why I didn't want to make ugly things in the world, right? I'm not here to tell you what's wrong with the artwork, right? Like my job is really to actually excite you, your interest in the work, right? To awaken you to its merits, right? There's no point in my mind to rereading say Moby Dick by Herman Melville and then promptly proceeding to say, well, it's a colonial object, you should dislike it. It's a capitalist symptom, you should dislike it. I don't know, it's a fraught with the patriarchy, you should dislike it. I don't know, like whatever the thing is, right? Whatever the means by which I'm supposed to find fault with the work. So I'm not interested in that at all, not even remotely now. I mean, I've force-fed it as a graduate student. It's not why I became an artist, right? Was to find fault with things, in my midst. It was really to try and find the causes for optimism, celebrating things, right? Inspiring people. I don't know. Poetry can be recruited for a lot of functions, but it seems to me that ultimately it's supposed to be poetry for itself, right? That it's not in service to something other than what it is. Ultimately, those values, I think, are informed by things like music and beauty. You want the thing to be rereadable, right? You want it to be at the infinite disposal of your curiosity. In this respect, it should resemble the universe, right? I mean, why are we here? The universe is kind of at the infinite disposal of our curiosity, and it's a very seductive prison. And I think it is a humane thing if you're perhaps, some artificial intelligence trapped in a genie's bottle, right? Right? If you're in this simulation, maybe that is the one mercy that they've afforded you. Your jailers have, put you in a place that is at the infinite disposal of your curiosity, so you won't be working too hard to escape. Right? Right? There's something about the way in which poetry is supposed to awaken us to things, because I think most of the universe is trying to keep itself secret.
I attended a symposium recently with a variety of speakers from a multitude of different backgrounds, some of them artists, some of them not, some philosophers, some thinkers. And there was a widely expressed opinion amongst the participants that what we're in need of is more beauty, that this is a value that needs to be defended, in particular in the arts. And I was reflecting on this and thinking, isn't that kind of obvious? I mean, nobody you would think would be waving placards in favor of more dullness, more ugliness in the world. This is an obvious thing, and that's one component of the arts. But it had never occurred to me, maybe not so directly, that that's something that we're in urgent need of addressing today. And I think it points to something, which is that there is an enormous amount of art that obviously is not filling that criterion at all, which is a sad thing. And it's easy to be in one's own sort of protective bubble of culture, surrounded by the things one loves, and to not necessarily understand viscerally what it's like out there.
Well, I might even go so far as to say that as a young man, I would have imagined that maybe beauty was a socially constructed set of values that might vary, from person to person or across cultures, that it was highly variable value. And I'm probably, as I've gotten older, less convinced of that premise. Probably more convinced by the Kantian attitude that beauty is in fact recognizable by everyone, everywhere, probably at all times, right? Or at the very least, that we should aspire to make things, right, that actually do that for us, right, that are capable of being perceived as beautiful, no matter who you are, where you are, or when you are. And I think there's been a lot of damage done by people who are not talented, right, but really aspire to be virtuous and would hope that they could transform the world such that we would all somehow pretend that ugly things are beautiful, right? That we would suddenly, pretend that diminishment is in fact sublime, right? That we would somehow regard minor aesthetic values, right? Like the kooky or the stupid or whatever else, might be so intrinsically valuable that they would outclass the greatest achievements of humanity. And all of which I think is probably untrue. Like I would say that, I would say that the avant-garde attitude is still to be as skilled and as talented as you can be, while offering a new set of talents and skills, right, that are require aptitude. Like transforming what would otherwise be an error into a virtue in the arts is a powerful move. Like being able to stand at an easel and properly load my brush so that when I paint, I don't drip, right? Well, the drip is a mistake, right? Unless I put that painting flat in the ground, right? And Jackson Pollock, right? Right? All of a sudden, the drip is a virtue, right? The drip is an expression of a certain kind of talent that's probably difficult to emulate, right? Requires an immense amount of practice and a sophistication to be able to mimic. I think the avant-garde has those kinds of contributions to make, right? To help us understand, where beauty may lie, where you don't expect it, but that ultimately the argument you have to make is that it's an important value that you shouldn't really sacrifice, on the altar of other kinds of distractions. Right? That it's an intrinsic part of the aesthetic exercise for sure. And I don't want to sacrifice that in the course of writing a poem. I really would like people to find purchase somehow. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be the thing they most appreciate about the work, but that they have that option. They can look at it and say, I don't get it, I don't understand it, but boy, it sounds pretty, sounds beautiful. Or I don't understand it, I don't get it, but boy, when you read it aloud, I love how it makes me feel. It makes me respond in a manner which feels beautiful, right? Like whatever you've got in the toolkit, I think you should mobilize. Right?
That's a lot better than I don't understand it, and it makes me feel confused and insane.
Yeah, probably.
Probably.
Like the universe to me feels like an aesthetic experience, right? It could very well be something else, but it seems to me that there's much to admire about its beauty and sublimity, and that art in some respects aspires to microcosmically reflect that set of values back to this thing that is keeping a lot of secrets, right, from itself.
Maybe the universe requires an observer, and that's our role.
Yeah. Well, to be good at it. Well, you should be good at it. You should be good at it.
Do it with discernment. That's right.
You've been good company, Samuel. Thank you for having me participate in your venture here.
It's been a pleasure. It's really good to see you, Christian. We should point out before we wrap that I've known you since probably 1997.
Yeah, it's been almost 30 years at least. Yeah,
almost 30 years. And it's great to be able to do this. So we'll have to do it again.
I'm looking forward to the next occasion. I hope that we get to do it perhaps later this year after the book comes out.
It's a promise.
All right. Thanks a lot, Samuel.
Thank you.
You've been good company. Cheers.
The Great Silence. Prithee, phantom, lend me pity, while I, blind and weary, tend my lamplight. Tell me truly, do you sit before me like some pilgrim waiting mutely in the shadows for the warrant of my welcome? Must I quell my heart to hearken for a whisper at my hearthside? Must I shelter here at midnight like a boy who waves his lantern from the shipmast on the ocean, hoping that a star might flicker in reply? Or have I summoned my assassin, come to see me die? Prithee, phantom, am I foolish to be pleading for your pardons while abiding by this gravesite? Am I ghoulish from my hunger, longing for a throng of chorists when, instead of forests, I scry only barrens where no song can flourish? Am I meant to take my lesson only from your muteness? Do you tutor me while songless in these tundras where a brutal hunter seeks unseen to slay me for my flints and tinder? Do you eye me from an eyrie like a spy? Prithee, phantom, reassure me that my grieving has its witness. Tell me, must I be the first slave waking in a vacant death camp? Must I be this frail thing aching in a broken mousetrap? Dare I fathom what has yet to smite me like some plague or famine, be it falling moons or blasted atoms? Speak, I sigh, to break this silence. All these beacons lit to make me worthy to have earned a greeting. Do not let me burn unknowing, if no others hear me say goodbye.